Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Stage is a series on this channel where games are played in the Commander Tavern for your entertainment. In this episode of The Stage, I'll be showing one of the 4 games I played a month ago from drafting a slightly edited version of my Commander Cube with SplitSecond, Affinity for Commander, and cEDH TV over on the internet. I was very excited to have this event happen as these are 3 of my favorite Commander channels, so being able to draft this version of my cube online with them was quite the honor. I was fortunate enough to draft my cube with Sequeira, Baal, and Luís from SplitSecond, Martin and Alex from Affinity for Commander, and Mons and Pontus from cEDH TV. This video is from the second round of games where I played a match against Sequeira, who built a Model the Gnarled Oracle Thievery Reanimation deck, Alex, who built a Breya Ethereum Shaper Blinking deck, and Mons, who, believe it or not, built an even stronger version of his Sisay Witherlight Captain deck with a limited environment. I was able to build my dream team of Soul Advocate Eternal, partnered with Grusilda Monster Masher. Essentially, this is a 5-color Grusilda deck. Hopefully, I'll be mashing together quite the monstrosities. Curiously enough, everyone who drafted the cube that day was able to build the deck they were super excited for. As for you viewers, if you're excited over or like any of the cards played throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Higher tier patrons get access to a VIP section of my Discord server as well as early access to scheduled videos on YouTube. You can find a link to that down in the description too. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Sequeira keeps an opening hand of Malicious Affliction, Caller of the Untamed, Underdark Beholder, Thriving Moor, a Swamp, Opulent Palace, and Drowned Catacomb. Since his commander has a mana sync ability, he starts off with a great hand with 4 lands that will give him all of his colors. He also has amazing removal in Malicious Affliction. Caller of the Untamed is going to be busted, but you'll see why in a moment. Alex keeps an opening hand of a Plains, Boros Guildgate, Scoured Barrens, Boros Signet, Eldrazi Displacer, the Locust God, and True Conviction. He's missing blue in his lands, but it's fine because the Locust God isn't going to be cast anytime soon. He does have True Conviction for when he eventually gets flyers from the Locust God and Breya. Speaking of which, Eldrazi Displacer is going to help him blink Breya for value when he gets a colorless mana source. Mons unfortunately ended up mulliganing down to 3 cards, having regretted doing so too aggressively in the beginning. Even so, his 2 plains and a brushland are enough to help him get a turn 2 Sisay. Don't worry, soon you'll see why. I keep an opening hand of 2 forests, Spy Eye, Snapdax, Apex of the Hunt, Prime Speaker Zagana, Faeburrow Elder, and Azorius Signet. I'm going to be able to get the Signet and Treefolk out on curve, which is going to help me get ahead in mana. I don't have much in terms of color variety, but as long as I can get Soul out, then the Elder will tap for a ton of mana. Before the game even begins, in fact before decks are even shuffled to begin the beginning of the start of the game, there are already turn -1 actions. Sequeira reveals Caller of the Untamed, which he uses to exile Clocknapper from his sideboard into the game. Now he can steal anyone's beginning of the turn for just 5 mana and tapping it. As if this weren't strong enough, he reveals Arcane Savant, which he uses to exile Emergent Ultimatum from his sideboard into the game. And then, to top it all off, he starts with the Hunter on the battlefield. Not to be outdone, Mons has some actions of his own. He reveals a total of 12 cards between Conspiracies and Heroes. He's not even coy about it, and right off the bat reveals Adrana's Valor, Brago's Favor, Hired Heist, Incendiary Descent, Mucio's Preparations, and Natural Unity, something he could have done at any point in the game. But he chose to do so now, obviously naming Sisay Witherlight Captain for their hidden agenda ability. On top of that, he revealed Advantageous Proclamation, the Slayer, the Savant, the Warmonger, the General, and Power Play, which made moot having to roll a die to see who starts the match. It's a good thing he drafted Advantageous Proclamation because his deck needed to run 5 less cards since he drafted so many cards that don't count towards his deck size. So even though Mons started with a 3-card hand, he also started the game with a smaller deck, 7 additional life, and being the starting player. I start the game a bit more humble than them with just 2 heroes on the battlefield, the Avenger and the Warrior. Both of these are great for the deck I built, especially my commanders, so I can't complain. Alex was even more humble than us and had no turn -1 actions. No one had any turn 0 plays, so we proceed to Mons' turn. Mons draws a card, plays a brushland, and then passes. I draw a card, play a forest, and then pass. Sequeira draws a card, then 1-ups everyone by playing a Library of Alexandria. He then passes. Alex draws a card, then, maintaining his humility throughout, plays a Boros Guildgate, and passes. Mons draws a card. Suffering from no such humility, he plays a Plains and taps out to cast a turn 2 Sisay. A Sisay with that slew of Conspiracies I mentioned earlier, meaning that she enters with a +1/+1 counter. Mons taunts our fear and says that it's only going to get once. He cackles and then passes. I draw a card. I play a second forest. I then tap out to cast an Azorius Signet, hoping to eventually be able to do something in the future. I then pass. On my end step, Sequeira taps the library for mana, believe it or not. He activates Moto's Eminence ability, discarding Underdog Beholder. He reveals a ton of cards, making the table realize just how busted his deck is until he finally reveals a Llanowar Elves, like 50 cards later. He then takes his turn. He untaps, then draws a card. He now activates the library to draw a second card. He plays a Swamp and then passes. Alex untaps, then draws a card. He plays a Plane and then taps out to cast a Signet of his own, Burrow Signet. He then passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He plays an island and then explains that now is when the fun begins, much to everyone's dismay. He sends Sisay to Sequeira. His multiple conspiracies trigger, so he pays 1 white to give indestructible until end of turn, and takes 1 damage to pay 1 green to put a +1/+1 counter on her. In response to blocks, he taps out to activate Moto, discarding Wolfbriar Elemental. He reveals cards from the top of Mons' library until he reveals a 2 CMC creature. Mons reveals a ton of cards from the top of his library until he reveals Tilonali's Summoner. No spoilers for the first game, but upon seeing it, Alex got some nasty flashbacks. In any case, Sequeira uses it to block Sisay. Afterwards, Mons passes. I untap, then draw a card. I play Vault of Champions. I inform the table of my incoming heroism as I tap down to cast Soul. I then give it haste with the Warrior. I enter combat and swing at Sequeira, who now has nothing to block with. Having sought my vengeance from the previous game, he takes 4 commander damage and I pass. Sequeira untaps and draws a card. He activates the library to draw another card. He plays an untapped Drowned Catacomb and then passes. Alex untaps and draws a card. He plays an untapped Isolated Chapel. Seeing the insanity on the board, Alex decides to be evil himself and taps out to cast Mana Barbs. In response, Sequeira taps his lands before they can ping him to cast Malicious Affliction. Unfortunately, Soul is black, so he had to go for Sisay, which was still a good choice. Alex laughs maniacally at the upcoming strife he's caused and passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He plays an island and then taps out to immediately recast Sisay. He takes 4 damage from Mana Barbs. She enters with a +1/+1 counter. He then passes. I untap, then draw a card. I skip over my first main phase and head straight to combat, sending Soul at a once more defenseless Sequeira, who takes 4 more commander damage. In my post-combat main phase, I play a Vivid Grove. I cast Faber Elder, taking only 2 damage from Mana Barbs. I give it haste with the Warrior and then tap it down to cast Forgotten Ancient. I then pass. Sequeira untaps and draws a card. He activates the library to draw another card. He then plays Flooded Grove. He thinks for a bit and then passes his turn. Alex untaps, then draws a card. He plays a Swamp, wishing it had been blue instead. He takes 1 damage from Mana Barbs and casts Gamble, which triggers my Forgotten Ancient, making it bigger. After getting his card, he reveals Dredge the Mire at random from his hand, which was fortunately not the card he tutored for. He then passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He plays the Plains and then shows us what true fear is as he taps out, taking 6 damage total from his lands in order to cast Gigantha. How was he able to bruise Sisay and Gigantha together in this draft? Only Richard Garfield knows. In any case, it also triggers my Forgotten Ancient. Mons once more sends Sisay Sequeira's way. Unfortunately for Mons, he can't pay for any of the hidden agendas for Sisay this time. In response to blocks, Sequeira activates Moto for 4, taking 3 damage from Mana Barbs. He chooses Mons, who right off the bat reveals Kinaios Anterior of Meletis. Sequeira uses them to block and they survive combat thanks to that thick cake. I untap, then move all Forgotten Ancient counters onto Soul during my upkeep. I then draw a card. I once more go straight to combat, this time attacking Mons, who has Gigantha with Sisay. He takes 6 commander damage. In my post-combat main phase, I take 4 damage from my lands to cast my second commander, Grusilda, triggering Forgotten Ancient, making it even bigger. I then tap Faber Elder to cast Robot Chicken, also triggering Forgotten Ancient. After my opponents laugh at the ridiculousness of this promo, they then realize the dangers that it's going to bring, leaving only me laughing at the end. I then pass. Sequeira untaps, then draws a card. He then activates the library to draw yet again. He plays Sunken Hollow. He thinks a bit and then goes to his end step, triggering the Kings. Everyone chooses to draw a card. Sequeira drops an Opulent Palace and then passes. Alex untaps and draws a card. Alex plays the Plains, questioning what even is blue mana. Bearing witness to mine and Mons' board state, he casts Cackling Doom, taking 2 damage from Mana Barbs and triggering Forgotten Ancient. In response, Sequeira activates the Hunter, giving Llanowar Elves +1/+1. Now that they have the same power as the Meletis Kings, he chooses to sacrifice them to Cackling Doom. I have to sacrifice Soul, and Mons chooses to sacrifice Sisay. Afterwards, Alex takes a further 3 damage to cast Eldrazi Displacer, triggering my Forgotten Ancient. Unfortunately, not only does he not have blue mana, but now no colorless mana either. With his struggle becoming very real, he passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He plays a tapped Concealed Courtyard. He takes 2 damage from Mana Barbs to cast Golgari Signet, triggering my Forgotten Ancient. He then takes one more damage to tap it to cast another Signet, Celestian Signet, once more triggering my Forgotten Ancient. He then passes. I untap during my upkeep. I leave the counters on Forgotten Ancient. I then draw a card. I then cast Prime Speaker Zagana, only taking 1 damage from the single land I tap to help pay for her. She triggers Robot Chicken, creating a 0/1 colorless egg artifact creature token. She also triggers Forgotten Ancient, which has 4 counters on it. It should have been 7 +1/+1 counters, but I missed the past 3 triggers. I was too scared or focused at what everyone else was doing. It happens. In any case, Zagana enters, getting me 5 out of the 8 cards I should have gotten had I been paying more attention. I played Daragasa's Caldera, bouncing the tapped forest. I then tap out, taking 4 damage from Mana Barbs in order to cast Tamiyo, Collector of Tales. She triggers Forgotten Ancient and Robot Chicken, getting me a second egg that's really a bomb. I uptick Tamiyo, naming Rarity. I reveal 4 cards, none of which are Rarity, so Vivid Crag, Stolen Strategy, Dromar's Cavern, and Nira Hellkite Duelist all go to my graveyard. I only get 1 creature there for Grusilda, but that's okay because now that I end my turn, I get to discard to maximum hand size. So I discard Archetype of Endurance and Roommate Dragon. Sequeira then takes his turn, untapping, then drawing a card. He activates the library to draw yet another card. Who says the Library of Alexander isn't broken, right? To think it was just an uncommon. He plays a Swamp. At the end of his turn, the Meletis Kings trigger. Everyone draws a card except for me. I play Bloodfell Caves, gaining 1 life. Sequeira drops another Swamp. During his cleanup phase, I asked him to discard the fattest creature in his hand, but he decided to be mean instead and discarded Pox. He then passes. Alex untaps, then draws a card. He plays an untapped Sea of Clouds, finally getting access to some sweet blue mana. He takes 5 damage from Mana Barbs in order to cast the Locust God. Everyone thought he was going to play Breya, but with the Meletis Kings out, he can get some more blockers in the long run. It triggers Forgotten Ancient, getting even bigger. He then passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He plays a Plains. He takes 4 damage from Mana Barbs for recasting Sisay, triggering Forgotten Ancient once more. She enters with a +1/+1 counter. He then passes. I untap, give the Ancient's counters to Zagana, then draw a card. I play a Forest and then think a bit. I tap down Faber Elder to activate Grusilda, mashing Archetype of Endurance with Nira Hellkite Duelist, becoming a 12/11 legendary enchantment creature board dragon with flying, trample, haste, and hexproof. Hexproof that is also given to all of my other creatures and taken away from everyone else's creatures. Being as Mons was streaming the extravaganza that day, I decided to give something worthwhile to the viewers at home, so I take 4 more damage from Mana Barbs in order to mutate Snapdack's Apex of the Hunt onto the Nira Hellkite Duelist Archetype of Endurance mashup. The mutate spell triggers Forgotten Ancient and Robot Chicken, creating yet another egg that's a bomb. When it mutates, I gain 4 life and deal 4 damage to the Locust God, promptly returning it to Alex's hand. I then enter combat, attacking Sequeira with Zagana, and Mons with my Abomination of a Monstrosity. In response to blockers, Mons activates the General, exiling it to give Sisay the extra boost needed to find the blocker he needs to save himself from Nira Snapdacks. It should be noted that Grusilda gives menace to all of the combined, enchanted, and or equipped creatures, so either way Mons should not have been able to block this monstrosity with just 1 creature. Either way it's fine, this doesn't really ruin the result of the match. He activates Gigantha to activate Sisay, looking for Vivictus Asmati the Dire. In response to it entering the battlefield, Sequeira takes 4 damage to activate Moro, discarding Simic Guildgate in order to target Mons. He saw a false prophet there earlier when he threw his library with Moro's ability, and he's going to risk it for the biscuit and hope to get it in order to block Zagana with it. Unfortunately, he whiffs hard and hits Akira's follower instead. In any case, both my opponents have blockers. Sequeira happily loses the Merfolk while Mons takes 18 damage from my attack, surviving by the skin of his teeth with just 1 life. In my post-combat main phase, I uptick Tamiyo once more, naming Rarity. I reveal Demonic Collusion, Burnished Heart, 3-Headed Goblin, and Temple of the False God. After the madness dies down, I end my turn. Sequeira untaps, then draws a card. He then activates the library, drawing another land. Frustrated at his mana flood of only drawing lands, he plays a Forest. Doing nothing else, he goes to his end step, triggering the Meletis Kings. Everyone draws a card, and Sequeira drops an untapped Hinterland Harbor. He then ends his turn. Alex untaps, then draws a card. He plays a Swamp. He takes 5 damage from Mana Barbs to recast the Locust God, triggering Forgotten Ancient. He then takes 2 more damage to cast Dowsing Dagger, once again triggering Forgotten Ancient. He gives Sequeira the 2 plant tokens upon it entering the battlefield. He then passes. Mons untaps, then draws a card. He casts Jack in the Mox, triggering Forgotten Ancient. Not wanting to risk tapping it and losing 5 life, he passes. I untap, then in my upkeep I move Forgotten Ancient's counters onto Nira. In my draw step, Mons responds by activating the Savant, exiling it to freeze everyone else's creatures. In response, I activate Furborrow Elder to activate Grusilda, matching my Broodmate Dragon and 3-Headed Goblin, essentially getting a 3-Headed Dragon. it enters the battlefield creating a 4/4 flying dragon token. The Savant's ability resolves tapping down all creatures Mons doesn't control, which won't untap during their controller's next untap step. In my main phase, I play Temple of Silence, scrying 1 to the bottom. I uptick Tamiya once more, naming Rarity for the viewers on Mons' livestream. And success! First from the top, I reveal Rarity, Ishai Ojutai Dragon Speaker, Mana Confluence, and Jared Golgari Lich Lord. Rarity goes to my hand and the rest go to the graveyard. I take 4 damage from Mana Barbs in order to cast Null Brooch, triggering Forgotten Ancient and Robot Chicken, creating yet another Egg Bomb. I then pass my turn. Sequeira untaps his non-creature permanents and draws a card. He plays a forest and then activates the library to draw again. He finally draws something to get rid of the Mana Barbs to get Mons back into the game, and what a something it was. Sylvan Primordial. He takes 7 damage from Mana Barbs to cast it. It triggers Forgotten Ancient. At least when it enters the battlefield, he targets Mana Barbs, Golgari Signet, and Null Brooch. Thanks to that, he looks for 3 basic forests and put them into play tapped. To think there was a time when green was the worst color in Magic. On his end step, the Meletis King's trigger, with everyone drawing a card except for me. I play Vivid Meadow. Sequeira then drops a Thriving Grove, choosing blue. Since Alex drew a card, he creates a 1/1 flying insect. His turn is now over. Alex untaps his non-creature permanents and draws a card, creating another insect. He then plays a Scoured Barrens, gaining 1 life. Wanting some much needed blue mana, he equips Dowsing Dagger on one of the insects. He then completely taps out to cast True Conviction. He then enters combat, sending both insects to me. Now, since they both have double strike, Alex chooses to ignore the first Dowsing Dagger trigger so that the insect is still a 3/2 when it hits me the second time. On the second strike is when he transforms it into Lost Veil, dealing me 8 combat damage in the process. Now Alex finally has a significant amount of blue mana. He then passes. At the end of his turn, Mons activates the Warmonger, exiling it to give his creatures +2/+0 and haste until end of turn in order to pump Sisay. He activates Gigantha to activate Sisay, cheating Azor the Lawbringer. When it enters the battlefield, none of his opponents can cast instants or sorceries during their respective turns. He then takes his turn, untapping and then drawing a card. And what a card it was, Prophet of Kufix, which triggers my Forgotten Ancient. He then enters combat, sending Sisay and Azor my way. Then, in response to damage, he activates Gigantha to activate Sisay, cheating in Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. Now, not only does he deal me 12 damage, 6 of which is commander damage, but now all of my creatures are goaded, making me Mons' puppet, for the time being. He then passes. However, Sequeira wasn't having any of that Prophet of Kufix nonsense, and casts Victim of the Night, targeting it and triggering my Forgotten Ancient, of which I've lost count of how many times I've forgotten to put the +1/+1 counter on it, ironically enough. Anywho, the Prophet dies and then I take my turn. I untap, leave the counters on the Ancient during my upkeep, then draw a card. I play a Plains. Since Mons doesn't have any flyers or creatures with reach, I cast Spy Eye. I then give it haste with the Warrior. Since this creature is the only one not goaded, it's definitely going to Mons. Since I have to attack with all of my creatures, I don't want to risk any shenanigans. So I activate Favorable Elder to activate Grusilda, matching my Jared with Mons' Prophet of Kufix. I then proceed to attacks. I send Spy Eye to Mons, the 3-headed dragon, 3 egg tokens, dragon token, Zagana, and Forgotten Ancient to Sequeira, and Nero and Robot Chicken at Alex. In response, Sequeira activates Moto for 1, discarding Liliana Death Wielder to try and steal a 1 CMC creature from Mons. However, he had no more left. In any case, had he found another blocker or miracle, I could have used Jared to fling bodies at the entire table. Passing to the damage step, all of my opponents take lethal, and I win the match. This event was way more fun than I expected it to be. I hadn't drafted my cube with 8 people before, and I'm so happy it worked out so well. From that draft, we played 2 games where I first played with Sequeira, Baal, and Luís from SplitSecond, which you can see that game in the link above, while Mons and Pontus played against Alex and Martin. The second time around, Pontus and Martin plays with Luís and Baal, while us 4 played the game you just saw here. This game was such a blast to play, and absolute madness before the game even started, thanks to Sequeira's and Mons' turn -1 plays. Alex had been commenting about the evilness of Mons' deck while I was saying the same about Sequeira's deck. However, the all-star by far in this match was Alex playing that Mana Barbs. It put Mons and Sequeira in check to the point where Sequeira was hardly able to play. If not for the Mana Barbs, Sequeira would have been way more dangerous. Trust me, his Moto build was no joke. Also, Mons having to mulligan down to 3 cards really set him behind, and even then he almost had it in the end. His Sisay deck is also a force to be reckoned with, since he essentially had a guaranteed turn 2 3/3 Sisay with the potential of getting her out on turn 1. Alex was also color screwed from the get-go without a blue mana source. Having got an Eldrazi Displacer without a colorless mana source also kept him behind as well, since blinking threats would have been very helpful. Even then, he put tremendous pressure on the table. I was just lucky that my deck performed as well as it did against 3 superior decks. I was having so much fun most of the time that I missed plenty of Forgotten Ancient triggers, which is probably why that card is named that way, because of all the Forgotten triggers. Quite ironic, I know. Even then I managed to pull the win with my chunky board state thanks to all the monsters I drafted for Grusilda. Suffice it to say, all 8 of us had loads of fun drafting the cube and playing those games, and I hope you had fun watching this one and any others on cEDH TV's Twitch stream and SplitSecond's and Affinity for Commander's channel. I would once again like to thank Sequeira, Luís, Baal, Alex, Martin, Pontus, and last but certainly not least, Mons for spending the day drafting my cube. If you haven't already, check out their channels, which I'm going to link in the description below. I would also like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. I also want to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. It also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Stage on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy playing.